This is part 48 of ASP.NET MVC tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss creating custom HTML helpers in MVC. Please watch part 47 before proceeding. We'll be working with the same example that we worked with in part 47. Notice that at the moment when we navigate to the details view, along with the employee's personal details, we can also view his photo. And to render this photo, if you remember in part 47, we have used the image tag and specified the source and alt attributes. Okay, but then this is a bit complicated. We don't want any sort of complicated logic within our view. We want to move this logic into its own HTML helper. So we want to achieve something like this. We want to call a method like image and then specify the source and alt parameters, and then this method is going to take care of rendering an image tag. But unfortunately at the moment we don't have this image HTML helper. So let's see how to create this custom HTML helper. So to create a custom HTML helper, we need to add an extension method to a class called HTML helper. Now you might be wondering, why should we add an extension method to HTML helper class? That's because if you look at, for example, to render a text box, we use @html.textbox. Similarly, to render a text drop-down list, we use @html.dropdownlist. So what is this HTML? This is the property of the view. So if I right click on that and then if we go to the definition, notice that this property is actually returning an instance of HTML helper. Okay, so and within this class, we have these methods, drop down list, text box. All of these are implemented as extension methods. So if we want to have something like @html.image, then we need to implement that as an extension method on this HTML helper class. And adding a method as an extension method to a class is very straightforward. All we need to do is have a static method inside a static class. So our extension method name has to be image. So here the name of the method is image, and that method has to be a static, and it has to be inside a static class. And then the first parameter for that extension method has to be the class for which we are adding that extension method. So in this case we are adding this extension method to the HTML helper class. So the first parameter is of type HTML helper, and then we need to precede that with this keyword. So this is what will indicate that we are adding this extension method to that class. And then you can have whatever parameters you want, since to generate an image tag we need the source and the alt attributes, values for both of those attributes. So we have those two parameters there, source and alt. And then to build the tags themselves, so obviously this function should build an image tag, specify the source attribute and alt attribute, and then return that HTML string back. Okay, so basically to build the tags we are using tag builder class. Okay, and then we are adding an attribute, source attribute, to that image tag using tb.attributes.add function. And then notice that here we are using something called virtual path utility, and I'm invoking this function toAbsolute here. So what are we actually doing with the help of this function here? Now if you remember, the source attribute is actually relative path. Okay, so we need to convert that relative path to a URL. Okay, and to do that, this function is going to help us. Okay, so it's going to take that relative path and convert that to a URL for a resource. Okay, and then we have the alt attribute here. And finally notice that obviously tag builder, we're converting that to the string. And then look at that, we have something called tag render mode.self-closing, because if you look at the image is a self-closing tag. Okay, so that's why we have this tag render mode.self-closing. So this toString method is going to return a string. Okay, but then why are we returning an iHTML string? Why can't we simply return a string? Because toString is going to convert that to a string, and then we are wrapping that inside an MVC HTML string and then returning it. Now this is because if you return a string back, by default all content is HTML encoded. Okay, so if this returns an image tag with source and alt attributes, so if it is HTML encoded, instead of rendering the image, it is simply going to display that encoded HTML on the view. Okay, that's why we need to convert that to be of type iHTML string. Okay, so strings of type iHTML string are excluded from HTML encoding, so that's why they will get rendered as expected. Otherwise they will be encoded and you will view the encoded HTML string on the view instead of rendering the image itself. If that doesn't make sense now, don't worry, we'll actually understand that with the example. Okay, and to speed things up, I have this code already implemented, so let's copy this and then let's add a folder actually, and let's call this folder custom HTML helpers. So all our custom HTML helpers are going to reside in this folder, and then let's add a class, and let's also call this custom HTML helpers.cs. So we have the namespace mvcdemo.custom.html helpers, and within that we have this custom HTML helpers class, and this is the same class that we have, same method that we have on the slide. And the stack builder class is present in system.web.mvc namespace, so let's go ahead and import that. Okay, let's build the solution. Okay, so this class has to be a static method because an extension method has to be a static method and it has to reside in a static class. So let's make it static. Let's build the solution. And then let's use this image extension method within our view. So within the details view, we want to replace this image tag with @html.image_html helper. But then notice that we can't see our image HTML helper. That's basically because we need to include that namespace within our view. So using mvcdemo.custom.html helpers. So that's the namespace within which we have our image extension method. So now when we say image, notice that we can see that and we get IntelliSense as well. So where is the source coming from? The source is going to come from model.photo, and the alternate text is going to come from model.alternate text property. Let's build the solution and let's refresh this view. So as far as the behavior is concerned, there shouldn't be any change. It should again display the photo as expected. The page is still refreshing, so notice that there's no change in the behavior. The photo is still displayed, but now we're using this image HTML helper. Now notice that we are using this using directory using mvcdemo.custom.html helpers on the view. Now let's say if you intend to use this image helper on all your views, instead of having this using directive on each and every view, you can actually move that into web.config file. Again, notice that we have web.config file in the shared directory. So if you put that using that namespace within this web.config file within the shared directory, then it will be available for all the views. So within web.config, notice that we have pages and a system.web.pages.razor element. We have pages, under that we have namespaces. So let's add a namespace, and then our namespace is mvcdemo.custom.html helpers. So we can move that right here, and then within our view we can get rid of that, save everything. Let's build our solution, and we should still get IntelliSense and everything should work as expected. So @html.image. Now notice that it doesn't still show, the IntelliSense doesn't show the image HTML helper. That's because sometimes Visual Studio behaves weirdly. So let me close the solution and then reopen that once again. Then that should fix that issue. So now let's go back and then try to @html dot image. Notice that it shows the IntelliSense shows the image extension method after I have closed and opened Visual Studio. So at model dot photo and at model dot alternate text. Okay, now notice that within the custom HTML helper we are returning iHTML string. Now instead of that I can simply return a string, and let's see what's going to happen. So if I return a string, then I don't have to wrap this inside an MVC HTML string, so I can simply return that string. So let's build the solution and let's refresh this view. Okay, so instead of returning iHTML string, we are simply returning a string. Now it happens that MVC HTML string implements that iHTML string interface. Okay, but then here the change that we have done is we are simply returning a string, and notice what happened. Okay, because of the fact that all strings are encoded by default, we have that encoded text displayed instead of actually rendering that image. Okay, that's why from our HTML helper we need to return something that implements iHTML string. Okay, all right. On this slide you can find resources for ASP.NET, C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.